Hello and welcome to the Traceability Insider Podcast. I'm Emme and I'm your host for today's episode. Today we are talking about the meaning of traceability in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Great Lakes region. We have Benjamin Clair, who is an economist and expert analyst of risk and challenges related to the value chain of resources originating from weak governance countries. He has contributed to the development of multiple innovations in the fields of mineral traceability, supply chain due diligence, and distributed data governance to promote transparency in resource-rich countries. He previously created the Better Sourcing Program, also known as Better Mining, and has more recently developed the Fair Digitalization Framework for local stakeholders to reclaim ownership of mineral certification process and demonstrate compliance without foreign intermediation. All right, Benjamin, Clair, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I think we can head into the conversation already. So tell us a little bit about your recent trip to DRC. I think there was a mining week there. Well, what did you expect? What happened? And what is the overall expectations of the conference that happened in Congo?
That's right. Thanks for having me, Amy. And I remember we were supposed to have this conversation when I was there in DRC. I was there for the Mining Week, DRC Mining Week conference, which is which was a very interesting conference where all equipment manufacturers, some investors, and all organizations involved in the Congolese mining sector gather. It's interesting it was interesting to see such an event of quite a magnitude being organized in the region. There was not so much talk. There were side discussions on the topic of supply chain responsibility, of traceability, of international regulation, but most of the discussions revolved around the investment climate at large, governance structures to facilitate investment. There's this broader, like large-scale mining types of interests, which do not really connect with traceability so much. So it was interesting for us. It was an opportunity to connect with some partners and future partners in some of the projects we work on in the country.
What are some of the key players that were there in terms of standardization and regulations?
Oh, well, you had mostly DRC government player. You had international donors and organizations involved in, for example, the cobalt sector, copper players. It was very broad private sector representation as well. You had representatives from China, India, the US, and Europe all in one place, which was also quite refreshing because there's not so many conferences where essentially the East meets the West, where Africa, Asia, and Europe, America are all represented fairly equally. You often have conferences where Americans and Europeans go, and then conferences where Asians or Chinese go. The DRC Mining Week was interesting in how eclectic and diverse the audience was. On the governance topics, you also had some experts, some law firms. It's very much focused on the DRC, so you had some law firms from Kinshasa or international law firms with an office in Kinshasa discussing most of those matters. I believe the ICGLR must have been represented, but I did not find that representation. No. It's very Congo focused. I think I say that because some of the topics that you and I have discussed in the past relate to all countries, trade between countries, export of minerals, collaboration between, for example, ICGLR member states. The DRC Mining Week has a very, very strong focus on industrial mining activity in the south of DRC. Other countries were present. Zambia had a representation. I think Angola had a representation. I am sure other Central African countries had representations that I missed. But these are topics: large-scale investment, large-scale procurement, that are a bit distant from the traditional topics we touch on when we talk about traceability. Although traceability is also relevant to that sector.
Okay. Any traceability solutions that were there in the conference?
Not that I noted. There's obviously a few initiatives out there that are floated around. There was a company that provides large bags for minerals transportation. That was also talking, I don't remember the name of that company, that was also talking about using those bags as kind of a tracking solution. So by adding a QR code on each bag, it contributes, and you scan this QR code, it contributes to tracing your materials and things like this. I'm sure there was other traceability systems providers over there, but not that I engaged with. I must say that the field is a bit, and we will get to that today, I suppose. But it's not a massive business interest. Traceability. There's some controversial topics or some situations, especially in the 3T and gold sector, that have made it an important discussion point. But fundamentally, you are talking, the traceability systems provider, you're talking about large organizations that happen to provide this as software, as a software solution, and then customize that software solution to every individual supply chain. These companies typically don't work only in the mining and minerals sector. They work also in for traceability for agriculture, for product, or other asset tracking, and as a result, do not necessarily consider a conference like the DRC Mining Week like an absolutely crucial conference to be represented at. They are more traceability oriented or supply chain oriented conferences where these companies will be.
That's cool, because if you look at the fact that probably, as you said, it's not a really massive investment that they should be in, I wonder what is the business model that these traceability solutions are using. Because as you see, more regulations are being there, more standards that are requiring companies to comply. So these traceability solutions are definitely in need, but it looks like the sustainability is not yet visible. So what is the common business model and that these companies are using currently?
I think so. I see traceability as really a component of supply chain responsibility. What you need, and I guess we will discuss that as well in more detail, but what you need is much broader than simply traceability. Traceability is going to help you identify how a shipment, what is the chain of custody of a shipment. It's going to help you identify who are the supply chain actors that were involved in your supply chain, and hopefully, if traceability is complete, the site of provenance, the origin of the materials that you receive. And building such a system involves collecting transaction information at the level of the mine site of origin, collecting transaction information whenever the materials traded between different supply chain actors, collecting transaction information at the time of export, and then reconciling the different transaction points to and the different transactions between different parties to match export data with mine data, and to map the entire chain of custody of a shipment. That doesn't give you supply chain responsibility. That gives you some form of evidence of provenance, depending on the traceability solution you use. It gives you some evidence of provenance, but it doesn't tell you what are the conditions at provenance. It doesn't include necessarily an audit or a consultant or someone being present on the ground to verify. In addition to traceability system, you could think of sensor or IoT devices locally or whatever process locally to reinforce, to complement your traceability solution. So to get back to your point, the traceability systems providers, usually they're going to be providing a software, an information management system, or an application that allows you or allows supply chain actor to collect this transaction data at different stages of the supply chain. They're going to provide equipment or recommendations for equipment to collect, manage, exchange, report the chain of custody data. They are usually going to provide some implementation services, maintenance services, customization services, so that this software solution can be as tailored to the specific needs of a supply chain as possible, and then charge or propose a business model that, in theory, should be that of a software solution provider. So software support, maintenance, troubleshooting, and all the rest of it. So it should be a software license. Now, it's been tempting for some traceability solution, in particular in the quote-unquote conflict minerals space, to add other layers of services around traceability when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to gathering information, assessing, etc., and also to create a business model that is a bit more based on the amount of materials that are exported through the traceability system. There's also some creative solution that are going to tell you that are going to be based on the amount of data that is processed through your traceability system. Some others are going to be based on the number of queries, the number of API calls, etc. So you can have a certain variety of business models, but I would say that systems providers themselves are mostly going to be marketing a software license and maintenance support services around it.
What are some of the leading technologies companies in the traceability world that have proven to be sustainable across many years?
I must say I've worked for the most part on small-scale mining, as you know, on minerals trade in the Great Lakes region, and so I don't necessarily have a very broad perspective, a global perspective of the successful actors. I know that there is a ton of small players that are involved in the sector, but you also have large companies like Avery Dennison, for example, that are provided like a kind of traceability for different purposes. You have a company in Canada that I came across a few times called Optel. There's also a very general traceability solution provider. They used to have they purchased, I think, a company that at the time that was called GeoTraceability. Some people interested in the ICGLR might remember GeoTraceability. But I'm only quoting a few names that come to mind. There's really a ton of different providers. A lot of some companies are spin-off of big brands. For example, I don't remember names, but I remember that in the cocoa sector, cocoa and coffee sector, sometimes you would have a large buyer of coffee, for example, setting up internally, developing, creating a traceability solution to manage their risk on their supply chain, to identify the provenance of their supply chain, and then realizing, oh, that's an interesting product we developed here. Let's just spin it off and license it to others so that we can turn a business out of this traceability system. In the Great Lakes region, traceability has a different meaning, and really, I think we need to elaborate, but traceability has been used as a term to consider a whole lot of things, to consider certification, to consider due diligence, assurance, and And in that field, some even more like specific, context-specific solutions have been developed over time. You can think of Minix, you can think of what Better Mining has been doing. You can think of what the ISKI program has been implementing. But to conclude on your point, it's a sector that it doesn't take so much effort to create a traceability system. There's like almost open source frameworks that exist to match transactions, conduct a mass balance reconciliation, and things like this. What takes some effort is to understand the specific context of a supply chain and to customize the solution to make it work. So there's a lot of small players, I would say.
As you speak of the Great Lakes region, of course, traceability to the Great Lakes region is something different and is taken to another level due to different regulations that were set for the Great Lakes region and other standardization. I want to know why really the Great Lakes region, and I think I've heard of the term conflict area high risk zones. Why was the term defined, and why do we have all these standardization and regulations coming from the Great Lakes region, especially for the 3TGs or even other commodities? I want to understand a little bit on that key point, why traceability is different on the Great Lakes region, and why does it matter, honestly, and why should we really make it a big point or a big shift for our countries in the Great Lakes region?
Yeah, and that's a great subject. So I got into this space around 2011. So what happens before 2011 is not from direct experience. It's from learning about the topic. But in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, we've seen a lot of what I would call supply chain activism happening, which was that instead of targeting traffic like smugglers in different parts of the world, shady smugglers, activists started to make the connection between the situation in certain countries and the situation of mining, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in DRC, connect that situation with a prestigious end users, consumer brands. So instead of saying, the mining conditions are atrocious in Congo or in Senegal or in South Sudan, or in Colombia, and it's the fault of this shady company that no one has ever heard of, which wouldn't catch much attention, these activists started to connect the circumstances of tantalum production, in particular tin cassiterite production in Central Africa, with end users, with Apple, with Intel, etc., which made it a much more palpable issue for international consumers, which made headlines, which was a very attractive topic attracted suddenly a lot of attention. And their goal was to flag what was happening at the time in Eastern DRC in particular. The goal was to expose how funding was being allocated to continuation of armed conflict in Eastern DRC, thanks to international supply chains procuring minerals from the region. So a lot of money was flowing into DRC that was then allocated towards funding the conflict. At the time, you had militias controlling mine sites. You had, it was a country that was at war for many, many years. And the revenues from the minerals was contributing to the continuation of this conflict. Supply chain activists exposed this. Suddenly, the conflict in Central Africa, the conflict in DRC, became the problem of every consumer in the West. At that moment, companies didn't know what to do. Companies like brands didn't know what to do to protect their reputation. They didn't know how to respond to this because Their supply chain is complex. They are not buying directly from the DRC. They didn't know what to do. So regulations started to be crafted. Some say because activists were successful in delivering their message to Washington, but I think also regulations started to be crafted to help downstream companies respond to this reputational risk and to manage to provide a response to this issue that they were now connected to the conflict in Eastern DRC. Regulation, the first piece of regulation, what some Congolese ended up calling Obama Law or Dodd-Frank, Section 1502. So it was squeezed into the Dodd-Frank Act in 2008 as an extra section which said that listed companies in the US should be responsible basically for ensuring that the metals and minerals contained in their product did not contribute to the conflict in Eastern DRC specifically. This turned into an SEC conflict minerals rule. It turned into an obligation for every listed company in the US to check their supply chain. And suddenly this started a whole response from across stakeholders. There was an embargo. Kabila at the time suspended exports of minerals from DRC until the matter is resolved. All miners couldn't mine anymore, couldn't export their materials. Suddenly, millions of people found themselves without income, not just armed groups, obviously armed groups, that was the goal, but also local population, local citizens found themselves without any revenue. So the entire world started reacting. It was like, okay, the goal is not to ban procurement of minerals from that region. It is actually an important source of livelihood for these communities. The goal is to check that those minerals come from places where they are not contributing to conflict. And so a whole lot of discussion started. What to do. And a lot of these discussions focused on the traceability, focused on establishing systems to identify where products are coming from. And conflict affected in high-risk areas was a concept used as part of the development of some sort of international standard for how you're supposed to manage risk on your supply chain, which is the OECD guidance for responsible supply chain of minerals or something like this. The OECD guidance attracted a lot of people around it, gathered a lot of stakeholders around it. The development of the guidance was a truly multi-stakeholder process where everyone sat around the table to identify what could be a standard approach to ensure that procurement can happen, but that when it happens, it is done in a way that does not contribute to the funding of conflict. In order not to stigmatize any specific country, just like US regulation had done, which was a little bit harsh at the time. But in order not to stigmatize any country, it was decided at the time that the OECD guidance would actually apply to any conflict-affected or high-risk area, which is what CAHRA stands for, and that for any conflict-affected or high-risk area, companies involved in the supply chain of products, when they identify that a CAHRA is part of their supply chain, are advised to implement due diligence measures, a five-step framework to apply due diligence on their supply chain, which is essentially risk management, demonstrate risk management, investigate and assess, manage risk. And here's how to do that. Here's what's recommended by the OECD framework. And as part of this five-step framework, there's a piece on traceability, but it is only a small piece of what companies should be doing to engage to manage risk in their supply chain.
This started as a DRC problem when the Dodd-Frank Act was there. So how did it expand to the region, to Rwanda, or even come up with the term itself, while it was only a DRC problem at the beginning?
Yeah, the conflict that was exposed mostly, and the dramatic conflict at the time involved Eastern DRC, but the sale and trade of those minerals was not limited to DRC. At the time, it was evident that some of the minerals produced in DRC were not just exported directly from DRC; they were exported from neighboring countries, and that making exports subject to due diligence in DRC without making surrounding countries subject to the same obligations would be a recipe for smuggling out of DRC. If you don't need traceability or due diligence in Burundi, but you need it in DRC, then as a Congolese miner, legitimate or not legitimate, violent or not violent, I'm going to do everything I can to smuggle my minerals out into Burundi. And so it would have been a little bit, I think people at the time recognized that it would have been a bit it wouldn't have worked basically to make this regulation apply only to a very confined area. So the 9 countries, I believe it's 9, surrounding the DRC were also in scope of US regulation. It's important to say that a few years later, EU regulation did not focus on these 9 or 10 countries. EU regulation went straight for the OECD type of approach, which is, okay, you know what, any conflict-affected or high-risk area, which is a very broad, equally vague terminology, would require a level of due diligence. But it started in a way, and I remember back in those days talking to DRC government representatives and to Rwanda representatives, and it was seen, this regulation was seen and continues to be seen as a very unfair, discriminatory regulation, but is in fact rather, it's been implemented in terrible fashion. A lot of things need to be changed, but is in fact, is in fact ahead of its time. In a way, if I can express myself this way, is that after this topic of conflict in DRC, we've seen the child labor topic also in DRC, but for the cobalt supply chains, we've seen environmental topics pop up in Indonesia and in other parts of the world. We've seen corruption, drug trafficking, or money laundering rather, topics pop up in Colombia or in Peru, and we've seen other forms of, and I'm only talking about minerals, but we've seen other forms of growing supply chain related concerns on the origin, on the conditions. So, in a way, sadly, the Great Lakes region country were not. Well, it was never going to go away. This expectation, they were just way ahead of other countries in terms of their obligation to comply, and it served in many ways. It served as a testing ground for tools, systems, models that will eventually apply across any countries. And you start seeing that much more, like with each new year, with each new piece of regulation around the world, with all discussion around ESG over the years, you can tell that, certainly most supply chains are not subject to regulation, although in Europe it's more and more broad. But whatever materials is contained in your product, you should then now have this thinking, and it also applies to carbon markets as well. It's like, what is my actual footprint at a much more upstream level? And so it is a regulation. It is a forced. It was discriminatory, but it's not a useless, unnecessary effort. It is actually, it guides where the world is going anyway. We need to understand better what is, as an individual, what is my footprint.
In 2008, we see the Dodd-Frank Act coming in place. Then further on, we see the OECD guidelines coming in place. Then after a few years, we see the ICGLR coming up with regional certification minerals. I wonder how these standards are different And how do they comply with each other first? Are they interpretable with each other first? And if the countries here in the region were actually involved in order to create those standards. So were they imposed those standards, or were they actually also involved in the whole process?
It's a very interesting point. So what happens at the time is that, and from, again, I saw that from a distance because I only got involved at a time when the OECD guidance was getting finalized, I would say around 2012 or something, I think it was. What happens is that supply chain activism that I mentioned earlier, like the concern, and I call this supply chain activism, but basically the very legitimate concern around conflict financing in DRC had led to industry partners starting to make efforts to manage risk even before regulation came about. And then regulation comes about and it's like, hello, we are, for example, the tin industry. We have already taken steps to mitigate that risk. And so please make sure that in the implementation of the regulation, it follows the kind of steps that we've already implemented. And then the multi-stakeholder group gathers around, at the OECD, gathers around developing guidance, and you have those industry interests that are already ready with some traceability solution, with some response to the problem. You have civil society actors, whether they are local civil society actors or international civil society actors, are at the table. I think it's never been perfect. It's far from perfect, but from a consultation and inclusion standpoint, there were a lot of voices represented at the table, and a voice that we heard a lot from the local civil society at the time was, of course, conflict financing, but also, thank you very much for your regulation, but because of it, our communities are suffering now. Our communities are not able to. So thanks for your concern, but the way it's been imposed upon us has created unintended consequences that are absolutely catastrophic. So please find solutions so that we can export quickly. And so the OECD guidance was kind of developed around before the final implementation of the US law, which is the SEC rule, basically, was published. And the SEC rule was quite conveniently endorsed the OECD framework as a reference framework for how supply chain due diligence should be conducted. That made the OECD guidance the absolute reference framework for this sector. And the OECD framework itself was kind of influence or parts of it were actually coming from stakeholders such as traceability systems, such as due diligence programs, so experts on the ground that had already started their own measures and made sure that the OECD framework reflects those measures. And then the ICGLR, I believe, was a little bit was worked on these topics around the same time when the OECD framework was developed, and came up with what would be the government or member state government's response, and how to implement these expectations, turn them into national legislation. What can we do as member states in practice to respond to these mounting pressures? What also can we do as member states to not become dependent of international private actors, or to become a little bit more able to control our destiny in the face of regulation coming from the US and the EU. And so the ICGLR regional certification mechanism took a lot of it. We took some inspiration from the OECD framework, but was also going in its own direction. So in each of these contexts, you have different stakeholder groups with different interests, with different preoccupations, and so it all kind of looks the same, all feels like it has the same objective, ultimately does have the same objective. Everyone working on these different frameworks had the same idea that we need to eliminate conflict financing, but through politics and different stakeholder interests and incentives, kind of developed slightly differently in a way that is, I must say, that for many years was confusing to everybody.
So what should nations do? Do they follow the OECD framework or do they follow the RCM framework?
If you mean member states?
Yeah, member states from the ICGLR. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean beyond the certification mechanism, it's the broader regional initiative. It's guidance. It's a collaboration framework. It provides some sort of standardized member state response to these regulations. If member states all adopt this common, turn the RCM into law, turn these regional certification mechanism expectations and requirements into national law because they have sovereignty to do so, and that there is consistency in the way different member states implement the RCM, and government agencies are properly capacitated to implement that regulation, and there's collaboration and exchange of information between member states, and the certification mechanism is properly audited in accordance with the regional certification mechanism, then, good, perfect, bad, whatever one may think about the RCM, if all these pieces were working, it would be functional. It would be doing its mission. Some people might come and complain that this is not perfect, this needs to be revised, but it would serve member states in their demonstration that what is happening inside their country is monitored, that the chain of custody of minerals is monitored, that mine sites are known, and that exporters are known. Unfortunately, it's not been implemented properly. There's been a lot of difficulties for many different reasons. It's not been implemented properly. And so what member states have done, because of some level of failure in the coordinated and collaborative implementation of the RCM, is that they've left, as usual, in emerging countries or less developed, less advanced countries, they've let international players come in, and instead of raising the credibility of locally led mechanisms, certification mechanism coming from the region, they've allowed third-party international actors to move faster and to establish themselves as the credibility bodies. And so the RCM has not been able, the development of the RCM or the existence of the RCM has not been leveraged sufficiently locally, not fast enough, not credibly enough, and as a result, the RCM is not exactly what international buyers look at when they want to make a procurement decision. Whether or not there is, and this is very sad to say, but whether or not there is an ICGLR certificate on a shipment is not what is going to convince an international buyer to buy or to not buy materials. So they should, to answer your original question, member states should have embraced the RCM, should have involved themselves in the RCM. In-country businesses should have leveraged also the RCM framework to create a local narrative in response to international pressure. And because this coordination didn't happen or hasn't happened yet, we let the local narrative and certification, validation, traceability be taken over by international bodies.
Who are those international bodies that are sort of playing the role that RCM should be playing?
Yeah, so the very first one that comes to mind is obviously the ITSCI program, which was very early, very developed by the tin industry or representatives from the tin industry in collaboration with, at the time, a US NGO, trying to find ways to support the export of cassiterite from the DRC. The initiative was so successful at the time that the coltan or tantalum industry, and even to some extent wolframite / tungsten industries, which were the other three T's, all gathered around that same program as a solution. And so that initiative came up with this bagging, sealing, tagging bags at mine sites implemented by the government. That came later. Bagging, tagging, sealing at mine sites, then some sort of logbooks, then another process in the trading of minerals with tagging in logbooks, and another process at export with tagging in logbooks. And this was meant with local monitoring, local assessments, local audit. And this was meant as an overall response that everyone should embrace. This was the solution for procuring 3Ts from the region. Very quickly, member states started to build their regulation in the context of the ICGLR regional certification mechanism. Member states like Congo and Rwanda in particular started to design their regulation, their mining agencies, to fit with that model. International buyers started to satisfy themselves with this program. There was a solution, and all stakeholders patted each other on the back and were satisfied with this solution, which at the beginning started with the greatest of intents. But then it didn't go so well. I'm not going to get into this because on a personal level, I started a competing traceability solution back in the day because I was concerned with the limitations of the existing program, and because also I thought it was a good opportunity. But so I'm a little bit biased. But what I saw of this traceability solution, of this kind of multi-stakeholder private sector led, was that it became corrupted. It was because it was not scalable. It was very hard to replicate. It was not necessarily resourced properly. It was not incentivized properly because it was charging operators based on the exported volume. So you have a traceability or due diligence solution that generates more income if volumes are high. This is a ridiculous incentive to allow more materials to be exported. There was a lot of questioning around the fact that it did nothing to prevent cross-border smuggling. But as a matter of fact, it became the industry solution. And if anyone would question this initiative, potentially you could question again the international market's ability to procure from the region. And so no one wanted to get back to a situation of embargo. So we created this situation where there basically was not an alternative. This traceability / due diligence solution is not perfect, but there is no alternative. We have to use it because otherwise we don't get to market. And even organizations that really wanted to promote the RCM, that really wanted to promote member state-led alternative to this traceability system, found themselves in an uphill battle to demonstrate that efforts were needed to move away from this private-led traceability solution. There's a lot more controversial aspects related to that traceability solution, but I'm sure it's now a lot of it is now public information. I'm sure that we don't need to talk about that.
No, we can touch a few points about that. So looking back now, that we went back from 2008 when the Dodd-Frank Act was there, then the ICGLR, then the RCM. Those are good initiatives if you look at the intentions and what they want to solve. But until now, you still see some conflicts in Eastern DRC. And probably there's still some smuggling as well. So I'm wondering, what is the gap? What did they fulfill as part of their objectives, and what should nations do to sort of counter that?
There are many, many, many gaps, but I will start with the elephant in the room, which is that in relation to today's conversation, which is that traceability does not mean, responsible supply chain. Traceability does not mean that conflict funding will be eliminated, and it does not mean that children will not come and work at the site. Traceability, if it works perfectly, traceability tells you where materials come from, but in order to tell you, and it tells you who are the participants in the supply chain, but it does not, on its own, it does not tell you who the beneficiaries are of this mine production. It doesn't tell you what are the conditions at the mine of origin. It doesn't tell you what the supply chain actors, political associations might be. It doesn't give you KYC information on these supply chain participants. It doesn't tell you even if the materials tagged at this mine site really comes from the mine site where it was put in a bag. So, and this is where the critical issue is that a lot of players have turned up to this context and have been like, okay, the current solution doesn't seem to be very popular. It doesn't exist. It doesn't satisfy people. It's too expensive. I'm going to come up with my traceability system. But traceability is not what this is about. What this is about, it's about establishing information gathering, what in a way is governance structures and systems, so that the monitoring of mine sites can be reliable and efficient. The monitoring of supply chain actors identified in the traceability system can be reliable and efficient, and that all the information related to these mine sites, supply chains, transactions, and the documentation that goes with it can be turned into risk management. So based on all this information that I'm receiving about mine sites, about supply chain participants, about traceability, I am able to apply apply risk management on my supply chain. So we talk about traceability, but in fact it's one, transparency, how to gather all the information I need in a reliable fashion about my supply chain, and two, risk management. What do I do once I have all this information? How do I respond to all that information? What sort of measures can I implement in order to minimize the risk of my supply chain? So that is, I think, a big issue when we basically turn the subject of transparency and risk management, we turn it into a simple kind of traceability topic. It means that the problem is not addressed in its entirety. And member states have often, in my view, underestimated what was really expected through the OECD guidance, what was really expected by international actors. In many discussions that I've been in, it's often like, oh, but if we have our own tags, or if we have our own scanning devices, or if we have our own GPS tracking devices, we will be able to improve traceability and access the market, or we will be able to create a member states-led traceability solution. But it does not, in itself, it is not sufficient to meet the OECD guidance. It is not sufficient to reassure international buyers. It is not sufficient to meet EU-US regulation. So the term traceability is already problematic. And I spent so much time. On talking about that I forgot the original intent of your question.
But so you touched a really, really important point that traceability does not mean compliance to so many things to so many key points that RCM and the OECD provide. But you also trust that the point that countries are also developing their own solutions, thinking that once they create that, they're going to have access to the market.
ITOA, the DRC, they did that with ITOA for gold. It did not. They created this based on what was happening in the 3T sector, they took the simplest component, which is traceability, and they were like, "Oh, okay, we're going to replicate that for gold, and we are going to put gold in small envelopes rather than big bags. Small envelopes, seal the envelopes, have this kind of tracking solution for gold from mine site to export. First, it costs a lot of money to implement, run, have the agents, etc. Second, it does not tell you in what conditions gold was extracted. And by the way, even if you have a very capacitated government agency going to the mine sites and assessing risk at mine sites, even then, there's an argument to be made that some international buyers would unfortunately not feel sufficiently reassured. So you need to find, they would need an auditor, and sending auditors to every artisanal mine site is not feasible. So this whole thing needs to be, we can continue to call it traceability if we want, but it's not about tagging, tracking, point A, point B, point C. It is about understanding or implementing mechanisms that provide confidence that the situation at this mine site is understood, that the situation along this supply chain is understood. It's not just about demonstrating provenance.
How does that look like in technology? Or is there any other form that's not technology for that?
So I could tell you about how we do it.
Yeah,
but
how do you do it at data stage?
More conceptually, I'll talk about why we do it this way, I guess. You have in those communities, in many communities, in many mining communities, it is not that we have a lack of funding towards gathering information. You have international buyers did spend considerable resources to send consultants that they would pay, let's say, 20,000 euros for 2 weeks or 3 weeks of work to go to visit Rwanda or the DRC or Burundi and understand the risk locally, talk to local stakeholders, ask them how the situation is, and write a little report for supply chain evaluation, mine site assessment, OECD assessment of the exporter and things like this. And those consultants come back home, send the report to their client. Their client receives the information and demonstrates that they can buy from this supply chain. Money is spent on consultants, auditors by so many different companies out there. Then money was spent on a due diligence program or multiple due diligence / traceability solutions. Then money gets spent by international donors like USAID, GIZ, or the EU and others, is spent on assisting mining communities on the ground. When they work with mining communities, those donors fund local civil society actors, or they fund local businesses, local organizations that do this work. They pay considerable amounts, they waste considerable funds just to understand the local context, send consultants, send local evaluation teams, collect information on the ground, etc. And then you have investors or candidate investors, you even have banks that have teams and people working for them, and investigators, researchers, etc. All these parties are kind of working in silos, each going to one mining community one day, to another mining community another day, sometimes in the same mining community in the middle of Congo. You have a consultant coming every week representing a different organization, all wasting considerable amounts of resources, gathering the data that is needed to demonstrate the conformance of a mine site. And all these actors are working each on their little space, with their little funding, with their little money, and wasting money continuously, repeating the effort of data gathering. And I think this is an absolutely incredible waste of resources. It's totally inefficient. All it does is finance an industry of consultants, experts, and auditors and certification programs that are actually monetizing local information. So to get to what we do at DataStake is that we believe in building solutions so that local stakeholders, member state governments, local civil society actors, local businesses can organize their local knowledge, can organize what they see on the ground in a way that helps them be the direct witnesses, monetize themselves their knowledge. And for example, if I'm a local organization with information on the mining sector in Ituri, DRC, whenever someone needs information about Ituri, it can be a donor, it can be the government, it can be international gold buyers, it can be international investigators, what have you. Whenever someone needs that information, they can find me and I can share access to my information with them, rather than as a local organization, rather than completing or providing information to others. I organize my own knowledge myself, and I make it available to whoever finances me or whoever contacts me. So I believe in distributing the custody of information to across stakeholders and helping stakeholders find ways to find each other, to find relevant information source. When I was a consultant myself, I was guilty myself. When I would visit back in the days 10 years ago, when I would visit a community in Rwanda to understand how these communities' circumstances are, I would be shocked because it would be very hard for me to have, even before I visit, it would be very hard for me to gather any knowledge. I could not find what NGOs were working there, what the government thought, what local company was involved there, who were the international parties that had already visited the community. I would have paid some money for accessing this information before my trip, so that I can prepare my trip and I can be as efficient as possible. But I could never find this. And then you visit locally, and local actors, they tell you, hey, nice to meet you. We're very happy to answer your questions. By the way, last week we answered the same question to someone else. And the week before, someone else asked us the question. And by the way, every month we report this and that to this international donor. And every year we report to the government. And I'm like, why don't we build an information ecosystem where you may not share your information publicly because some of it is sensitive, some of it is expensive, some of it is secret, but at least we should be able to find each other and, reward local actors for what they see, for the information that they hold, rather than sending international experts to assess on the ground. So it's one of the ways we address this. So we're building basically digital solutions, freely accessible, open source digital solutions, so to help as many actors as possible digitize, organize their information, do what they have to do with their application, and as they use those systems, become potential information sources for others. So we try and fairly digitize as many actors as possible so that they can become owners of their own narrative.
Yeah. So how are you planning to have this adopted by the member states? Are the member states one of the targets for that solution?
I think member states could be maybe not directly targets. Member states will have, for sovereignty reasons, for preferences, for infrastructure reasons, perhaps they will want to develop their own, on their own framework. They will want their own kind of information management system. However, they could ensure that as they organize their information on their side, in their database, in the government database or something like this, that third-party information systems used by NGOs, used by businesses, used by international investors, used by the banks, generate information in a format that the member state can use. And so this is the other component of where we position is how do you facilitate the communication between two separate systems? They are not built the same, but they manage information on a database in an Excel file, on a dedicated server, etc. They manage information. Some of it is confidential, some of it is private, some of it is sovereign, some of it should never be accessed by anyone, but some of it is not. Some of it is just, this is the number of people who live there, or this is how long it takes to go from A to B, or this is how many pits I saw last time, or this is an incident of child labor presence that I noticed last time. How do you? So member states should be focused on making sure that, regardless of what people are doing locally, they generate information that member states can process, that member states can use themselves in order to do their own determination. So USAID might be funding a program, a gender discrimination, or like a program to mitigate gender discrimination in some community. Let them do it. Fantastic. Thank you very much for your support. But there could be an expectation set from the member state or the government of that country to say, look, you can do what you want. Of course, you can help communities. We appreciate your support. But as you do so, please make sure that the information that you collect is also, at least in part, directly available to us. And therefore, the way you collect it matches the systems that we have in place in our country to monitor gender discrimination. Don't just create your own system in isolation and decide for yourself how you're going to deal with it. You can deal with it. You can do your things, but please, as a sovereign state, we expect that some of that information is going to be shared with us in a format that helps. And member states can be because they have sovereignty. They decide who can and cannot work in their country. They can set standards for how information is shared with them. So just like member states can set a standard for chain of custody data to be shared with them, they could set standards for how information on the community, information on the mine site, information on incidents, information on support to women or to children or environmental data should at least in part be shared with them. It's about creating data exchange standards that are much more broad than just traceability data.
Wow, that sounds like a game changer, and all the best with the adoption of it. I think it's something that I want to follow up really, really close with, because it's one of the problems that we're facing in the country and on the region, I believe.
Yeah, and it's not easy to it's not easy to envisaging that as at the level of an entire member state. Data management is an enormous challenge, and that's why we're on our side, we try and look at it at the level of one community, at the level of one topic, to test how information available on a mine site might be useful to a bank, might be useful to a buyer, might be useful to a government, and might be useful to international NGOs. And so the local actors that hold that information can become data providers for the entire world. So we try it at very micro level. What we hope is that if it works in multiple topics in different parts of the region, then it can catch pique the interest of broader structures and governments and all the rest of it.
Is there a model to incentivize people to actually share the information?
I think by allowing everyone to become the custodian of their own data rather than just share information with whoever pays them. By allowing everyone to become the custodian of their own data, you give them the opportunity to monetize it and to realize its value. And so it creates an incentive to generate more data, because if you start compiling information, pictures, for example, of a mine site, and someone comes to you and is like, hey, I'll support you and I'll give you some money and I'll help you take more pictures, you create an incentive for me to upload or add more and more pictures to my portfolio because it seems to be attracting interest. So take that broadly to concept of information. The more information I have and I compile, the more interest I generate from international partners, from everyone. So guess what? I'm going to compile as much data as possible because I am becoming an attractive information source. So I think by distributing custody of information, distributed data governance, you can actually create scalable incentives for everyone to become more transparent.
That is super nice. Really, really looking forward to see this adopted widely. So as we try to conclude this discussion, so we've talked about so many things about traceability, about standards, about solutions, about business models. But I want to sort of conclude on this one by asking a question about the member states, especially the neighbors in the country where the ICGLR is performing. What should they do at the moment to sort of mitigate the risks or even cover the gaps that are in between the different standardizations, the bodies, international bodies that are always giving new requirements of how things should be done? What should member states do currently? What should they prioritize?
I would say it's getting a bit hot in here. I would say that first and foremost, they should not be afraid of transparency. There is often a perception from member states that scrutiny is negative, that more information is going to put them at risk of getting exposed for one thing or another. And that, I don't know, if too much information is out there, the strategy of the country is going to be compromised, or some international activist is going to expose such and such, I don't know, corruption incident or difficult working conditions or something like that. I think we are entering a cycle where it's the other way around. It's the more open and honest and generous you are with what is happening, what are the challenges, what we are facing, the more open you are with this information, the more positive support you will get from investors, private investors. Investors, they need a lot of data, they need a lot of information, honesty, etc., in order to engage. Only dodgy investors can engage in opaque context. Structured, significant investors, they need a lot of data. Other partners internationally will always value more information being shared, even if it's negative. I think this is an important switch in mindset that needs to happen. I understand why it's like this. It's because in the wake of international regulation, there was a lot of pressure applied suddenly on member states so they became a bit defensive. They were like, no, everything is fine. Like, stop bothering us. And I think that we are past this stage, and it is not about being defensive and protecting your reputation in a defensive manner. It is about setting up systems that make you a reliable partner, that make you a transparent, and I think this is an important shift in mindset. And then once your credibility as a partner, your honesty, your credibility, your reliability as telling what is really happening on the ground is established, you will find much more support from your international partners in implementing the right solution to mitigate risk. We've regrettably adopted even traceability was like a defensive mechanism. Like, okay, no, don't worry, just put a traceability system and you can buy again, come back and buy our minerals. I think it was a quick fix that actually didn't work, because now we all find ourselves trying to patch the things that are not working. I think I think it starts for member states. It starts with transparency. It starts also with recognizing what I touched on earlier, which is the value of information. Recognizing the value of information does not mean hiding information. It means recognizing how to reward the ones who collect it, how to invite as many parties, how to incentivize them to share that information, and how, as a member state, I can become much more structured, much more able to make the right decision based on the data management and the data governance systems that I've implemented within the country. We talked earlier about the rules that you should apply, that you should set for any donor to intervene in your country. I think it starts there. It starts with having a real proper information management policy, not to hide information, but to make sure that as a member state, I am aware of what's going on. I can generate value from what's going on. I can make the right decision based on what's going on. It's not traceability for the sake of traceability. It's access to information for the sake of generating more value and mitigating risk more efficiently.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Benjamin, for sharing such important information for the Traceability Insider Podcast. I look forward to inviting you again in the future episodes.
Thank you, Aimé. Thank you and good luck.